Appeal to consequences. Now, it's common for people to consider the consequences when assessing the morality of an action, policy, etc. It is accepted by some people, at least, that harming people and things is morally bad and benefiting them is good. Of course, this is all debated, as all things are in ethics. There's also, outside of ethics, the idea that more is better than less, typically. In the case of ethics, it's often believed that if something creates more benefits than harms, then it's good, or at least acceptable. And if the reverse holds, then it's probably unacceptable. So, appeal to consequences is based on that moral intuition, but also based on the theory of consequentialism. Now, consequentialism itself, as we'll see when we talk about moral theories, is not necessarily a moral theory, a moral view, because you could do an appeal to consequences or accept consequentialism for non-ethical things. As a simple example, you can think of the typical business model as consequentialist, but not a moral theory, because the idea when you're running a business is to maximize your profits, and that's based on the consequences of what you do. So you'd assess your actions, policies, procedures, etc., based on how they produce profits. So doing something that creates more profits would be preferable than doing something that creates less profits or a loss. Now, the particular form of moral consequentialism that most people tend to keep in mind when doing an appeal to consequences is what's called utilitarianism. And we'll see that in quite a bit of detail when we look at the moral theories. Now, this method of appeal to consequences as a moral method is quite useful. And if you're at a loss to come up with a method for arguing for your position on an issue, I would recommend appeal to consequences. Even if you don't actually believe in utilitarianism, it's an extremely useful way of arguing because it has clearly laid out steps. It's relatively easy to do. You're doing essentially a plus-minus pro-con analysis and then applying the moral element. And it has a clear template for objecting and then replying. So it's a very useful method from a very practical sense of having an effective argument on the paper. So what is the actual method itself? Well, laid out in step format, the steps are these. First, you would do the usual sort of cost-benefit plus-minus pro-con analysis that most people are familiar with. So you take whatever it is you're assessing, the action, policy, etc., and then you would determine what sort of harms it creates, what sort of benefits it creates for those who matter. So the positive and negative consequences. The second step is weighing these positive and negative consequences. And then the third step, to make it a moral argument, is to argue that moral assessment should be based on the consequences of actions, policies, etc. And then the final step would be this. If you believe the harms, the negatives, the minuses outweigh the positives, the benefits, the pros, then you'd argue it's morally, or conclude it's morally unacceptable. If, on the other hand, the positive, the benefits, the pros outweigh the negatives, the cons, etc., then the reasonable conclusion would be that the action, policy, procedure, etc. is morally acceptable. And so again, essentially it's a pro-con analysis, cost-benefit analysis, harm-benefit analysis, with the moral element in there. So putting it into more of an argument form, here would be these steps. If you want to argue that something is immoral by an appeal to consequences, here's the steps you take to do it in terms of building the argument. So the first premise is the analysis. This would involve taking whatever you're assessing, a particular action, and then laying out the harms and benefits on your analysis. Secondly, and this is the critical thing that makes it a moral argument and not simply a plus-minus pro-con analysis, is you need to give a reason to the audience as to why moral assessment should be based on the consequences of actions. And without that, as we'll see in a bit, it would be just not a moral argument because it needs that moral aspect. Then, in the third premise, you would show that the negative, the harms, outweigh the benefits, the good. And so you would conclude that what you're assessing is morally unacceptable. Now, the opposite would be to argue that something is morally acceptable. And essentially, you're doing very similar steps. The first step is the cost-benefit analysis. You present the harms, present the benefits. Second premise, same as before, you would argue, give your reader a reason to believe that moral assessment is based on the consequences of actions. But in this case, you would argue that the benefits, the positive, outweighs the negative, and then conclude that what you're assessing is morally acceptable. As an example, we'll look at cheating in a relationship. But this also provides an opportunity to look at an important distinction in this method, which is the moral version of the argument versus, say, practical or other versions of the argument. So a common mistake when using this method, the appeal to consequences, as a moral argument, is to simply engage in a harm-benefit analysis. Lay out the harms, the benefits, don't include a moral element, and then draw a conclusion. Now, as I mentioned, this method can be used for non-moral reasoning. Whenever you're engaged in a pro-con analysis, say picking your major based on your chance of getting a job, you're essentially doing an appeal to consequences. You'd look at the major and say, here are all the pluses to it from the standpoint of, say, getting a job and making money. Here are all the minuses. And then the major that gives you the best chance of making the most money on those grounds would be the right choice on those conditions. And that would be an appeal to consequences, but it's not a moral argument. It's not saying what is the morally right major to pick. It's simply looking at it from the standpoint of money. Now, looking at the example of cheating in a relationship. Now, this is a good issue to address with appeal to consequences, because there are clear, harms and potential benefits, and you could weigh them and draw the appropriate conclusion. But a common thing that people do is just look at the harms and benefits, but don't include the moral aspect. Let's go through the analysis. So whenever you do an appeal to consequences, the first step is considering the harms and benefits. And people, of course, will have different conceptions of what are harms and what are benefits, and also they'll weigh them differently. And so this can be a matter of considerable debate. So in the case of cheating in a relationship, potential obvious harms would be things like diseases, unplanned, unwanted pregnancy. If someone's married, the possibility of divorce. There could be damage to a person's reputation. There could be financial damage, even physical injury, etc. Cars being keyed, that kind of stuff. Now, there have to be some benefits to cheating, presumably, because otherwise people generally wouldn't do it. And these would include things like companionship, pleasure, maybe some people like the risk, etc. Now, those are the harms and benefits one would consider, presenting them and then weighing them. Now, if a person concludes that someone shouldn't cheat because by not cheating they would avoid disease, and that's all, they leave it at that, that would be, an appeal to consequences, but not an ethical, not a moral argument, because it's simply, if you don't want to get a disease, you don't cheat. And that's a medical argument. If someone says don't cheat, because otherwise, if you're married, you'll get divorced and they'll be very costly and harm your reputation, that's, like a financial argument and a reputation argument, which is if you don't want to lose half your stuff, then don't cheat. And again, not a moral argument, just a practical one. And so a person could engage in laying the harms, the benefits, and then weighing them. But if they say, don't cheat because you'll get a disease with no reference to ethics, or don't cheat because you'll get divorced, or you'll get property damage, Those are all kind of like practical financial reasons not to cheat. So how do you make it into a moral argument? Well, you need that moral element. You need that critical premise about how moral assessment should be based on consequences. Now, there are a variety of ways to do this. One way is applying a moral theory, essentially also could be seen as an argument from authority, which we saw earlier. And you can use, a good example would be John Stuart Mill. We'll talk about him in part 2. And the simplest approach would be to say you're arguing in the context of utilitarianism and make that as your critical premise, because that would establish that plausibly morality is based on assessing consequences. And that's probably the easiest way to do it. I do the same thing myself when I'm writing like a quick blog post. I'll often reference utilitarianism and sort of say, on the assumption that utilitarianism is correct, here is the analysis. Here are the pluses and minuses, and here's the relevant conclusion. And that can be perfectly reasonable. Another option is to use an argument from intuition to argue that creating positive value is good and creating negative value is wrong. So creating more positive value would be better than creating more negative value. And one can, do that as well. Again, I'd say probably the easiest thing is, which is perfectly reasonable, is to say that you're arguing within the context of utilitarianism, and the main argument would be on presenting the harms and benefits and arguing for your analysis, arguing for your list of harms, why they're benefits, and then your particular weighing. So this is an extremely useful method, very effective, but the critical thing to do is always make sure to include that bit about morality should be based on assessing things based on consequences. And I've said this before, but I have to stress that it's a critical part. It's like, again, to use an analogy, it's like the carburetor on an old car. You could have all the other parts working fine, but no carburetor, the car is going nowhere. Or it could be like your phone missing the battery. Battery is just one part among many, but no battery and your phone's not going to be doing anything. Now, this method, as I mentioned before, is a very good choice for using in your paper because it has a very kind of easy template to it. You present your weighing of the harms and benefits, weigh them, include the step arguing that morality should be based on consequences, draw your conclusion. And then you can turn, for the purposes of the paper, to the objection reply. So here is how you respond to an appeal to consequences. This is how you'd argue, against one. So the first approach is to offer another assessment. That is often the battle. If people agree on consequences, the basis of ethics, the battle is over, which things are harms, which are benefits, and how much do they weigh against each other. And so one way to counter an appeal to consequences is to argue for a different assessment of the harms and benefits. That something that is one person alleges is a harm could be argued to be neutral by someone else, or perhaps even a benefit, depending on how someone sees it. And depending on how people see the world and their values, what may be a harm to one person could be seen as a benefit to another. And this can be something that may be seen as kind of bad, or it may be something, obviously the person who believes it would see it as something kind of good. This can often be a matter of like who it's harming and benefiting. So for example, if someone's looking at it from a political standpoint, from the standpoint of being like a Democrat, if something, say, harms Democrats and benefits the Republicans, someone who's on the side of the Democrats would see that as a negative, that as a harm. But if someone's a Republican, of course, something that harms the Democrats and benefits Republicans would be seen as beneficial. And another example would be like in someone's economic class. So if someone is wealthy and a new law benefits the wealthy and harms, say, people who are poor, from the standpoint of someone who's wealthy, that could be seen as a benefit to them and not a harm. And so different perspectives would result, of course, in different perceptions of harms and benefits. A person could still agree that, on harms and benefits, but offer a different assessment as well. Because there's the question of, relative weight. So a person might agree that something has a potential harm to it, but believe that the benefits outweigh it. For example, say you're having a moral debate over increasing taxes. A person may agree that taxing people more is generally not good for them. It generally takes away their money. But a person could argue that the benefits of having those increased taxes could be beneficial. So the relative weight could be such that from one perspective, the harm of the tax increase is accepted by both sides as a harm, and the benefits could both be accepted as benefits, say having more money to spend on various programs, but they could disagree about the weight. A person could say, yes, I accept that increasing taxes does inflict a harm on those who have to pay the more taxes, but the benefits of this are greater. And someone could put in an opposing viewpoint that the harms outweigh the benefits. Going back to our example of cheating in a relationship, a similar assessment. People who cheat, one would think, clearly believe that the benefits outweigh the harms. And people who oppose cheating would generally take the opposing viewpoint. So if you're arguing about the ethics of cheating in a relationship based on appeal to consequences, that would be a way to have the disputing sides. So if you were arguing that it was wrong because the harms outweigh the benefits, then a counter argument would be that you could take the devil's advocate role, and you could take the position of someone who takes the opposing view, that the benefits outweigh the harms, and making a case for that. So 2 ways to have another assessment. One is having a differing view on the harms and benefits, what they are, like denying that the harms are actually harms or denying the benefits are actually benefits. Then the other matter of dispute is the weighing of the harms and benefits, which weighs more. Now, in addition to offering another assessment, and this is kind of the flow of the argument, objection, replies. So you'd begin with your initial argument, presenting your assessment, your weighing, draw the appropriate conclusion. And again, a way to present an objection would be playing the devil's advocate, offer an alternative assessment or alternative weighing, or possibly both. And then, of course, the response to the objection would be to argue against that reassessment in favor of your original assessment. The second main approach, essentially is counter method, using some other method. So you could argue that some other factor besides consequences should be used when assessing the situation, whatever it is you're analyzing morally. So, for example, a common way to reply to a utilitarian is to embrace deontology, civically rule deontology, that the correct moral rules rule against the utilitarian approach. So, for example, suppose somebody gives a utilitarian argument, a consequentialist argument, in favor of cheating in relationships, provided that the person, is able to get away with it and enjoys it. So the happiness outweighs the unhappiness. And a person could make that case that as long as the person is careful, they don't get STDs, they don't get someone pregnant, they don't get caught, and if they enjoy what they're doing, they can make the case that the pluses outweigh the negatives. Now, a way to counter that would be an appeal to rules, that even if a person could do all that they could, take appropriate precautions, not get disease, no pregnancies, never getting caught, etc., and enjoy themselves, that they would still be doing wrong. How could one do that? Well, we'll see in the future the method of mixing norms. So a person could take the religious view against about adultery being a sin, using mixing norms, say divine command theory, to say that what is a sin in the religion, adultery, would be immoral, and therefore adultery, cheating would be immoral, even if someone really enjoys what they're doing, even if they never get caught. Now, you could also use appeal to rights, that when someone engages in a committed relationship, because one must be committed in order to be cheating, that the other person has rights in that relationship, and cheating, even if the consequences were positive for the cheater and the person being cheated on never found out, it would still be a violation of their rights. And so one can counter appeal to consequences with another method. It's commonly a deontological argument, because kind of the primary nemesis, as we'll see, of consequentialism is deontology, but one could use an appeal to rights or other methods. So that is the appeal to consequences. So stay safe, and I'll see you in the future.